We think about separation because of the circumstances of our times right now. I've had a lot of people jokingly or even in distress talk about virtual church. Well, I'm doing a lesson for you guys from my home office and my podcast studio. It's difficult circumstances when folks say, hey, it's safer to be away from each other than with each other. But you know, the early church had lots of connections and did quote unquote virtual church. Lots of Sunday mornings somebody got up and said, hey, our message today is from our beloved friend, the Apostle Paul. And here's what he's written. And instead of seeing a video or watching a PowerPoint, someone read a letter in Paul's words with their voice. So it's not unique to the church that preachers preach in the absence and come through a different means of communication. So I'm happy to be with you giving this lesson. And when you talk about connection, read, and I'm sure the guys who have already presented these lessons about Philippians, but read the love that Paul has for these people. Read in that context the love that they have for him. And then remember that Paul is in Ephesus. He receives the vision, come to Macedonia and help us. And he leaves straightway, goes to this city. It's a retirement village for Roman soldiers. And they're only there just a few days. On the Sabbath, they go outside the city gates to see if there's a place of prayer. And they run into the company of Lydia. They baptize her. They stay at her house a few days. And then one day while they're in town, Paul and his company are walking. And this girl possessed with a spirit comes behind them and says, hey, these men are the servants of the Most High God. And she shouts and shouts and shouts and shouts. And finally, Paul removes this spirit from her, which ends up causing a dispute. And Paul and Silas are placed in prison. There's the famous conversion of the Philippian jailer. And then the next day, Paul and Silas are asked to leave town. The relationship that Paul shares with these people, probably 10 days, maybe 15 days at best. I don't get the impression from the narrative in Acts that he was there like he was at Corinth for 2 years. Paul has not known these people very long, and yet he develops an earnest relationship with them, so much so that when he ends up in prison, they put together a gift, a relief package, and send it to him. So with that context in the background, the love that Paul has for these people and the love that these people have for Paul, he concludes his letter, and really what he's talking about is, hey, you guys don't worry. And if you're going to focus your mind on something, focus your mind on positive things. If you read the little book, Be Joyful, It Beats Being Happy, it basically outlines the letter to the Philippians. The book, Be Joyful, It Beats Being Happy, says there are 4 things that rob us of our happiness: circumstances, people, things, and worry. And then if you look at the outline of the book of Philippians, Paul talks about his circumstances, chapter 1, and no matter what circumstance I am in, I expect that I will glorify God whether I'm alive or whether I'm dead. And then he talks about the getting along with people. And he says, hey, don't do anything out of selfish ambition. Don't do anything out of vain conceit, but in lowliness of mind, consider each other's better than yourself. And then he talks about things. And Paul sadly says in chapter 3 of Philippians that, these people are destined for destruction because they put their minds on earthly things and not on heavenly things. And then when we talk about don't let worry steal your happiness or steal your joy, you get into chapter 4. And in chapter 4, Paul talks a lot about the mindset of joy and the mindset of how Christians should view most of their circumstances. In chapter 4, verse 2, he's basically going to talk to 2 ladies that he knows personally, that they've worked together in the kingdom. They've worked together with Paul in spreading the gospel, and he asked them to settle the dispute that's between them. And we have no idea what this was about. but either it was severe enough, it was hurting the church, that the Holy Spirit let Paul mention it in a letter, or this was something that was so dysfunctional and had become such a hurt for Paul to see these two sisters not living in harmony, that he wrote about it because his heart was breaking. And then he gets into the anxious message. Chapter 4, verse 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious for anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God, and the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Paul says, listen, I want you guys to understand that it doesn't matter if I'm in jail or if I'm free. It doesn't matter if I live or die. I'm going to glorify God in my body. And the things that people think are important or not, we're going to focus our lives on spiritual things, not earthly things. Paul in chapter 2 will say, and this is how you treat each other. You have the mind of Christ, who was equal to God, but made himself of no reputation. And then finally he gets to chapter 4 and says, and look, just be joyful. In all your circumstances, in any situation, be joyful. True joy is not contingent upon external circumstances. True joy is found in inner circumstances. And so Paul tells his audience, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everybody. In difficult circumstances, it's very easy to be harsh. It's very easy to be rude. In circumstances where we're afraid, and maybe you feel this way about safety, and I feel this way about safety, very easy to hurt feelings and have our feelings hurt. And Paul says, no, the guiding principle for you guys interacting with one another is let your gentleness be known to everyone. Why? Well, the Lord is near. And because the Lord is near, but because the Lord is coming, because we're looking for the return of the Lord, you don't really need to worry about anything. Be anxious for nothing. Now that's a pretty plain statement. You should be anxious for nothing. But in everything, the juxtaposition between nothing and everything. I'm not going to worry about anything, but in everything, I'm going to make my prayer and my petition and my thanksgiving be made known to God. I'm going to take any circumstance that shows up in life, and I'm going to pray to God about it. I'm going to ask God for the things I need. By prayer, I'm going to petition God for my supplies. And then once I've taken this burden or taken this care or taken this concern, I'm going to give it to God, and then I'm going to thank Him for His answer. Because if I ask God for something and He says, yes, that's what I needed. If I ask God for something and He says, no, that's what I needed. If I ask God for something and He answers it in a way that I did not expect, that's what I needed. And a person of faith thanks God for those things. Faith is not believing in God. Faith is simply believing God. Faith is believing that God knows what He's talking about and living like you believe God knows what He's talking about. So Paul says, it doesn't matter what your circumstances are. It doesn't matter what interaction you're having. It doesn't matter what's going on. Your calling card must be gentleness as you interact with people. And as you deal with the inner part of yourself, don't be worried about anything. But in every circumstances, by prayer and petition and thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God. Now, something happens when that is my approach to circumstances. That's magic almost happens when I take these things I worry about, and I give them to God. Because the peace of God, and God's peace is transcendent. It goes beyond our ability to understand. I don't know how providence works. I don't really know how prayer works. But God says you use it and I'll intervene in your life. If God wasn't active, then why did He give us permission and the ability to pray to Him? Why does He attune to us? I don't know how it works, but I know it works. So when I pray to God about these things, what should happen inside me is the confidence and the hope of faith will allow the peace of God, and the peace of God which transcends, surpasses all understanding, will guard the way you think and you feel. That's a translation from the NIV. It will guard your hearts and your mind, your emotions and your intellect. When I give my anxiety to God, God will come in and change the way I think and the way I feel. He'll guard your hearts and your mind. It's interesting, that term guard is like a military term. It's like setting up a perimeter around a building. It's setting up actually a blocking force. Several years ago, I was at the clinic. My phone rang. One of the local SWAT operators asked me, he said, "Hey, Lonnie, what are you doing tomorrow?" And I said, "Well, I'd probably be, at my office." He goes, "Well, Eric Rudolph, the bomber in the '96 Olympics, has been captured, and they've got him in the courthouse jail, and they're going to transfer him from the county court to federal court tomorrow. We're going to guard him. Would you like to be with us?" And absolutely. So that Thursday morning, I got up, drove to a place in town, showed my credentials, and sat on top of a bank building with two marksmen, aka snipers, and they brought this famous criminal out of the sally port, men with machine guns strapped to their chest, put him in the car. They blocked the road. They drove the car the wrong way up a one-way street, stopped at the federal courthouse, and walked out with this diamond formation of men around him and men on several buildings with long rifles watching him, guarding him. And had someone tried to let this man escape, that force there was guarding, so that wouldn't happen. Or if someone had tried to come and assassinate him, someone tried to hurt him, he was protected. That's the image. When you're in a difficult circumstances and when things are bad, you don't worry about it. You give it to God, you pray about it, you ask God for the things that you need, and you thank God for answering your prayer. And then God's peace that transcends all understanding puts these layers of protection, street level, up on the buildings, all around you. You're surrounded and you're guarded by the peace of God. Now, it's interesting that if I'm not going to occupy this cognitive space with worry, I can't just leave it empty. I can't just leave it as a vacuum. I got to occupy it with something. So finally, my brethren, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about these things. Paul says, you want to occupy your mind? Don't worry about what they're going to do. Don't worry about what they say. Don't worry about what whoever's in the office makes a decision. Don't let anything that anybody says upset you. Don't let anything that anybody doesn't say upset you. Don't let anything that anybody does or doesn't do upset you. Focus your mind on the things that are true and right and noble and pure and lovely and admirable. If it's worthy or excellent or praiseworthy, that's what occupies your mind. Now, if you just take that list of words and you put that beside your computer, or you put that beside your cell phone, and before you become a keyboard warrior and decide to attack somebody's position, or decide that you're going to dislike somebody's post, or decide that you're going to change the world with a Facebook post, you need to ask yourself, the thing that I'm about to say, is it true? And even if it's true, is it noble? Even if it's true and noble, is it right? Because just because you have a right to say something doesn't mean it's right to do. And just because you have a right to do something doesn't mean it's right to do. Is it pure? Is it lovely? And is it admirable? If you're not putting things out, either social media or from your heart or from your mouth, that fits those categories, they shouldn't be outside you. They shouldn't be leaving your mouth. They shouldn't be leaving your screen. They shouldn't be on Instagram. They shouldn't be said at all. And really, if it doesn't fit that category, you shouldn't be thinking about it. You turn on the news and they begin to talk about this, that, or the other. You go, hey, is this something that is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable? Is it excellent or praiseworthy? Well, if it's not, don't think about it. Turn it off. Change the channel. I'm not trying to be political, but I just don't watch the national news anymore. I haven't watched it for years. I don't feel like I don't know what's going on. I don't feel like I don't have a finger on the pulse of the country. But I'm just tired of hearing people whine about what quote unquote makes them unhappy or quote unquote cause them to be offended. And so much of the content of the things that we read and the things we hear and the things we get wrapped up worrying about, Paul said, look, don't worry about anything. But in everything with prayer and supplication and thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God. And once you give it to God, God's peace comes in. And when God's peace guards your hearts and guards your mind, protects the way you think and feel, then you can open up your mind. And it's not that you empty your mind of worry and it just stays empty. You empty your mind of worry, and then you fill your life with things that are true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable and things that are excellent and things that are praiseworthy. And those are the things that you think about. And then finally, he says, and whatever you've learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice. Paul says, I can tell you these things about my circumstances. I can tell you these things about how to deal with people. I can tell you these things about how you deal with material things. And I can tell you these things about worry, because not only do I talk the talk, I walk the walk. Paul says, if you've heard something or seen something or learned something, live it. And Paul's not ashamed to say, look, this is what I've said and this is how I behave, and there's consistency there. I'm afraid sometimes that we talk a better game than we actually do. I'm afraid sometimes we tell people how to deal with situations and we don't deal with those situations the way that we've actually advised other people to. I'm afraid sometimes that one of the biggest problems is not that we're hypocrites, that we're just inconsistent. And what Paul is telling his audience is, hey, you know me. You really only got to be around me for a very few days, but I love you and you love me. And the things that you heard and you learned and you saw in me, you live that way. Because my life is an imitation of Christ. My life is a product of being touched by the Master. My life is a product of being transformed into a living, breathing temple of God where I live in God and God lives in me. And Paul says that's how you live. And so he says, finally, brethren, these are the things that you think about, and then whatever you've learned, whatever you've received, whatever you've heard, whatever you've seen, put these into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. Now, I really think that's the bookends that ends his letter. The rest of this is some very personal notes. He's talking to some people. He's making some recommendations. He's thanking them for the gift. But you think about that as he wraps this thing up and he's talking about being anxious, he talks about the peace of God, and then he talks about the God of peace. Paul says if you have the mind of Christ and you've been baptized and you are in a citizenship, and the word citizenship that he uses in Philippians would mean a lot to those people because they were Roman citizens. He said, if you've got this citizenship in God, then you please understand that you're surrounded with the peace of God and the God of peace. Think about those bookends. And if you don't know the God of peace, then you can't have the peace of God. And if you want the peace of God, then you've got to submit to the God of peace. You can't have one without the other. There's used to be a famous poster in gyms that said no pain, no gain. It was N-O, pain, N-O, gain. And then somebody modified it and spelled no with K-N-O-W. If you know pain, you'll know gain. If you train hard enough till it hurts, you know the pain, you know the gain. Well, the same thing is true about Jesus. No Jesus, no peace. If there is no Jesus in your life, N-O, Jesus, then there's N-O, peace. But if you know Jesus, K-N-O-W, then you know peace, K-N-O-W, and the peace of God and the God of peace surrounds, protects, and dwells in you. And that's the last message. That's the last chapter in Paul's letter to the people at Philippi that he loved dearly and that dearly loved him. Don't be anxious. Rejoice always. When you get these anxieties out of you, Fill your minds with these things, and then your life, your heart, the way you feel, and your mind, the way you think, will be controlled by two things: the peace of God and the God of peace. May God's peace be with you.